So if I press T to bring up my tool shelf and click my physics control menu, you may have noticed this button down here which says animated before. And what this button does is it allows us to use animated objects within our rigid body physics simulations. So for instance, if I were to press Shift A and under Mesh add a plane, press S to scale it here, press Add Passive, and then select this cube, press G to grab, middle mouse to constrain, and press Add Active to make it also a part of the rigid body group here, and press play, then we'll see the cube fall to the ground. And I can press pause and go back. But if I were to say press I to insert a keyframe, which of course pressing I will insert a keyframe and not move the timeline down a second, but pressing F will insert a keyframe and move the timeline down a second for us. But if I were to right click 1 second down, press G to grab, middle mouse to constrain, and press I again. So I've now animated this cube moving from here to here, but if I press back and then press play, we'll notice that the cube doesn't seem to care that I animated it and it's not following those instructions. It's instead saying, I don't care that I have animation keyframes. I'm part of this rigid body world group, so I'm just going to be affected by collisions with other objects in this group and gravity. So to get the object to pay attention to the keyframes you gave it, you just press this animated button to let Blender in on the fact that this object is supposed to be animated. So if I press back and then press animated and press play, the object will now follow its animation keyframes. So the point of having an object using rigid body physics that's animated is that it can affect other objects within the rigid body group. So for instance, if I were to go ahead and press G to grab, middle mouse to constrain, then press F to insert a keyframe there. As you can see, pressing F inserts a keyframe and moves the timeline down a second, whatever you happen to have that set to. So we have it 30 frames per second, so it just basically moved it down 30 frames for us. And then G to grab, bring it back to the start here, and press F again. And if we press back, we have this basic little animation here. But the difference between this object being a part of the rigid body world group and just a regular animated cube is that other objects within the rigid body group will be affected by this animated cube. So for instance, if I were to add a bunch of UV spheres, and I'll go ahead and turn on high def shading here, maybe scale this down, G to grab, press W to give it some smoothing. And if we were to press add active to give this sphere rigid body physics, and then over in our physics tab, we could go ahead under rigid body collisions, turn the bounciness all the way up. And then if I click on the plane and also turn its bounciness all the way up, and we were to press play here, we'll see this ball be affected by the cube. So it really only hit it once, but you could see that it hit it. Whereas if we were to remove this cube from the rigid body physics group, if I were to press remove here to remove rigid body physics from this cube and press play, you'll see that it just goes straight through and not affects it. So I'll press back here to get us back to frame 0. Notice that if I click back on this cube, which is no longer a part of the rigid body world group here, notice though if I press add active that this animated property value is automatically turned on. And so any object that we give rigid body physics to via this physics control menu, because it does a lot of great contextualization for us to make sure that things work like we expect them to, will automatically take on this animated property if it has keyframes. So for instance, if I were to double right click over here and add this cone, so this cone has no keyframes. As you can see, it's not showing up here in our timeline area because it has not been animated. And if we press add active, this animated value will not be pressed in. But if we were to double right click over here and say add a torus, and say press F to insert a keyframe, and then S to scale, R to rotate, G to grab, just some kind of weird animation or something, press F again to insert another keyframe. Now there's 2 animation keyframes for this torus here. And if we were to decide, okay, I want this to be a part of the rigid body physics group, and we press add active, notice the animated value is now automatically in. So when we press play, it will maintain its animation keyframes and also be a part of the physics simulation. As you can see, it just knocked the ball right out of place there, which was pretty funny. So I'll press pause and go back. I'm going to go ahead and shift select both of these 2 and press X to delete them. And so now if we press play, we've got our box moving here. So there's really an endless amount of cool stuff you can do with these rigid body physics stuff, as well as activating the animated property on things. So for instance, if you were to pause and go back here, we could select this ground, press tab to go into edit mode, press space for face selection, E to extrude this up some, press shift E to do an inset, and then press space for face selection, and then alt select this loop of faces on this outer ring here. If we press Z to go into wireframe, we can see, yep, got what I want selected there. And press E to extrude. So now we've got a bit of a container wall for this ball. And then we could press Shift A and add another cube here. We could make like a flipper to rotate and hit this ball around. So we could make it a bit smaller, scale it down, G to grab. And what we would want to do, rather than pressing F or I to insert a keyframe for this and then manually rotating it, by pressing R and then maybe holding Z to constrain it or entering a value, a much easier way to animate something if you just want to animate its rotation or scale is to use this dimensions menu here. So if we click open here under rotation, where these different values are, as you can see, we can use these different values to manually rotate these things, or we could press reset to reset the object. But if we come over here and press I, where the Z value is, this will insert a keyframe for just rotation, whereas when we press F or I to insert a keyframe out in the 3D view, that will enter a keyframe for all three of these values. So then we could come down here in our timeline and use our right mouse button to drag the cursor down to say 10 seconds or so, and we could enter in however many times we want this thing to spin around. If we entered in 360, then the spinner would make one full rotation over the course of 10 seconds, but we want it to spin a lot more than that, so let's multiply that a few times and instead use 1080 and then press I while hovering our mouse over this highlighted area again. That will insert us another keyframe. So now this thing is spinning a whole bunch of times, which is sweet. And because we only animated the rotation value of this thing, we're free to move it around wherever we want. Whereas if we were to press F or I out in the 3D view to insert a regular keyframe as we normally do, values for all three of these, location, rotation, scale, would be animated, and once the location value has been entered for each keyframe, if we were to say duplicate this, whenever we press play, the duplicated objects would all snap back to the location in which the animation keyframes were recorded, which we don't want. So that's why it's nice to be able to just animate this rotation value alone. So we can make a bunch of copies of these and put them wherever we want. So I'll close up that dimensions tab there. And under physics control, we'll go ahead and press add active. We'll see the animated value is automatically activated for us because the menu is smart enough to know, hey, this thing has animation keyframes on it. I better activate the animated property. And so if I press G to grab, and bring this thing down low here and go ahead and press back so we can see what it looks like when it's starting out fresh. Press 5 to go into top view. Then we could press G to grab. And rather than pressing D to duplicate this, we should use Alt D, which will do a linked duplicate. And is nice because if we want to press tab to go into edit mode and change any one of these particular objects mesh, it will be reflected in all the different objects, which is cool. And it uses less resources to do a linked duplication by pressing Alt D rather than D. So we'll press Alt D to duplicate this and shift select all three of these. I can quickly tab Z to make sure I've got everything selected I want. Press Alt D to duplicate those again. And so now I've just got a bunch of these spinners here. And so if we press back and press play, we'll see the ball getting hopped around and eventually should come into contact with one of these spinners. It looks like it never did, just by chance of luck. Oh, I noticed that this is actually, one of these spinners are actually going into the wall, so we don't want that. So let's go ahead and press 5 to go into top view and select these, bring them over some, and select these ones near the wall and bring them over some so they're not colliding with the wall. Also, let's go ahead and duplicate this bouncing ball sphere a bunch of times. Why not? So let's press Alt D to do a link duplication of that, which uses the same mesh and conserves resources. Now if we press play, now we can finally see these things being wrapped around by our flippers. So if we wanted to change the duration of any one of these spinners, we could. I think I called them flippers a second ago. Flippers, spinners, whatever. For some reason though, I think because we did a linked duplication of these rather than a regular duplication, whenever we click on one of these keyframes from the spinner objects, they all get selected, which is strange because if you click on one of these and you try to adjust its keyframes to change it where it is on the timeline to change its speed, they all get selected. However, you can individually open these up and adjust their particular rotation values. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and click on this middle cube, press X to delete it, and then press X to delete this one. And then I'm going to select this one and bring it out to the middle. And then I think I'm going to press S to scale, middle mouse to constrain to make its flippers increase its length here. And let's just see what that looks like. You can see it's kind of running into the rest of the other guys, so we could move those away a bit. And maybe expand our overall kind of ground here. Let's see what that looks like. Part of the issue is we made the balls in the ground so bouncy that they're not having a lot of opportunity to be hit by our flippers down here. So what we could do is we could select the ground and we could turn its bounciness down to about a quarter of what its total was. And whoa, well, that's maybe too much because they are just immediately stop bouncing. So let's bring that up back a bit. Anyway, to change the speed of this particular flipper from the rest of these, for some reason we can't grab a single keyframe of a linked duplicate object, but we can open that object up to get to its individual animation values. And so for instance, if we use our right mouse button to drag the timeline down to this last keyframe here, we'll see this is at 1080. We could make this go way faster by, say, multiplying this value by 2. So rather than 1080, that would be 2160. So we could select that, enter in 2160, hit enter. And that particular keyframe has been changed now. So if we press back and press play, we'll see this one going twice as fast as the other ones. And you can see it's whirling these balls around ever so crazily, which is pretty sweet. So that makes me want to go ahead and close that up, press pause, go back, make there be a lot more balls. So I'm going to press B to do a border select, Alt D to do a linked duplicate, and maybe even scale these ones up so we have some different size ones going around in here. And let's press back, double click to deselect everything just because I don't want to watch the thing play out while they're selected. And then press play. And yeah, they're getting blown all around here. And let's duplicate them again just to bring more madness into the mix here. There we go. Pretty sweet. Well, I think that about does it. So I hope you try this stuff out and are able to make something really cool with it. So thanks for watching and stay tuned for more.